Well, I'd like to welcome you to the very first lesson of this series on the Old Covenant Tabernacle and how that it is a pattern for New Testament salvation. If you'd like to receive information concerning each of these lessons, I invite you to click on the icon or the red word subscribe that you will find in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. Well, let us begin with lesson number 1. The Apostle Paul wrote in Colossians 2:17 that many of the institutions and commands revealed under the law of Moses were actually shadows or blueprints or a type or a pattern. Let's take a look at his exact wording. Things which are a mere shadow of what is to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. Things in the Old Testament concerning the law of Moses were a shadow of what is to come. This teaching is also found in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 1, where it says, "For the law, since it has only a shadow of the good things to come, and not the very form of things." If I can try to clarify that, the blueprints for a house may show what the house will look like, but it's not the house. You can't live in the blueprints. You can use the blueprints to see that the house is built properly, but the house is radically different from the blueprints, just as a person walking down the street is different than the shadow that they cast. In reference to the tabernacle in the Old Testament, the writer of Hebrews also notes in chapter 8, verse 5, that the Levitical priests, these were the men who worked in the temple or the tabernacle, they served as a copy and a shadow of the heavenly things. This idea of a shadow, copy, pattern, blueprint, example is found throughout the Old Testament. I'll give you a few examples here. The Passover, when the Jews were taken out of Egypt under Moses, they slew a lamb and they marked the blood at the top and then on the left and the right hand side of their doorposts. And it really formed a pattern of a cross over the door with blood. 1 Corinthians 5:7 reads this way: "Our Passover lamb is Christ, who has already been sacrificed." The Passover shadows Calvary. Leaving their homes and their past lives in Egypt behind, the former slaves, directed by Moses, came to what appeared to be an insurmountable and an unpassable obstacle. The Red Sea was in front of them, and advancing behind them was the armies of Pharaoh, trying to bring them back into bondage. Under direction from God, Moses lifted his shepherd's staff, and the sea began to separate and to part, creating a pathway for the escaping slaves to forever sever their past life in bondage and go forward into their new life in the promised land. Several elements are seen here. There's the water, and there is also the pillar of fire and smoke that gave them direction. The Apostle Paul says this in 1 Corinthians 10. "Moreover, brethren, I would not that you should be ignorant how that all our fathers were under the cloud," speaking of the cloud and pillar of fire, which signified the presence of God, "and all passed through the sea. And all were baptized unto Moses in the cloud and in the sea. The Red Sea experience shadows New Testament baptism. They then approached Mount Sinai, where Moses went up and received the law. The law is the Ten Commandments, but it's much more than the Ten Commandments. It's also hundreds of statutes that they are to follow concerning many areas of their life, and also a pattern for a tabernacle or tent of meeting and worship that they would build. Paul, writing in Galatians chapter 4, says this in verses 24-26. Which things are an allegory? For these are the two covenants, the Old Covenant, the New Covenant, the Old Testament, the New Testament. He calls it an allegory. The one from Mount Sinai, which gendereth to bondage, which is Agar. But Jerusalem, which is above, is free, which is the mother of us all. He's making the comparison between the Old Covenant and the New Covenant, where the church is the New Jerusalem. We find all three of these put together in the tent of meeting, or the tabernacle, that was built according to the plan, purpose, and pattern that God gave Moses on the mount. We find that the blood is spilt at the altar where the animal is sacrificed, that the glory cloud, the pillar of fire, appeared over the tent where God's presence abode, and it was all in reference to what God had commanded at Mount Sinai. The Old Testament tabernacle indeed shadows New Testament salvation. Let's take a look at Hebrews chapter 9 in the New Testament concerning this tabernacle. The first covenant had rules for worship and a place for worship as well. This place for worship is what we're going to be examining in this study. A tent was put up. The outer one, which was called the holy place, in it were the lampstand and the table with the bread offered to God. Behind the second curtain was the tent called the most holy place. In it were the gold altar for the burning of incense, and the covenant box, all covered with gold, and containing the gold jar with the manna in it, Aaron's stick that had sprouted leaves, the 2 stone tablets with the commandments written on them. The covenant box was inside the second compartment of the tent in total darkness. Above the box were the winged creatures, representing God's presence with their wings spread over the place where sins were forgiven. But now is not the time to explain everything in detail, the Apostle Paul says. But this is how those things have been arranged. The priests go into the outer tent every day to perform their duties. The Holy Spirit clearly teaches from all these arrangements that the way into the most holy place had not yet been opened, as long as the outer tent still stands. You remember when Jesus was crucified, it says that the veil in the temple was ripped from top to bottom. This is the temple which we are studying, and that signified that God had opened up the way into his very presence through the death of Jesus Christ. The Apostle Paul continues in verse 9 to say concerning the tabernacle, this is a symbol which points to the present time. Notice the word symbol. We have seen symbol, type, shadow, pattern, blueprint, example, allegory. All of these things that we are studying in this building, this structure, point to the work and the ministry of salvation through Jesus Christ. And we want to take a look at that in great detail in subsequent lessons. This is a symbol which points to the present time. It means that the offerings and animal sacrifices presented to God cannot make the worshiper's heart perfect. We no longer provide animal sacrifices. We depend upon the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. But here in our little diagram, we show the priest bringing a sacrifice to the altar where the animal will be sacrificed. The animal will then be burnt upon the altar, and the priest will then continue through different ceremonies, regulations, rules that are all a pattern of what Jesus Christ has done for us. Now, it says in verse 10, since these or they have to do only with food, drink, and various purification ceremonies, these are all outward rules, which apply only until the time when God will have established the new order. The new order being the death of Jesus Christ, the fulfillment of all these things, bringing in his New Testament, which was sealed in his blood, and providing salvation for us in this current age. The tent that was erected by Moses eventually was replaced, and King David in his death had left behind for his son Solomon all the building materials, and Solomon built a magnificent temple. During the time of Christ, this temple had been added to and made much larger. It became a wonder of the world, and it was to this temple that Jesus was brought during the time of his temptation by Satan. And Satan said, if you be the Son of God, cast yourself down from this temple. Jesus overcame that temptation. Later in his ministry, Jesus was back at this temple. And when he saw those there who were turning it into a marketplace, he cast them out, saying, my Father's house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have turned it into a den of thieves. And even to this day, it is to this place that faithful Jews stand and pray at what is called the Wailing Wall. This is the foundation stones of where the old temple, where the tabernacle, where the blueprint, the pattern once sat. Well, that takes us to the end of this lesson, and I certainly hope that you will want to stay with us into subsequent lessons as we look in detail at each of the objects of furniture in this particular pattern. We will do a tour of the tabernacle when we meet again.